Welcome, everyone. I'm Cindy Breher, and I'm the SPS-CPAESS Deputy Director. My position affords me the pleasure of working with many of our wonderful scientists, like our guest speaker today. Today, I'm delighted to have you attend our CPAESS Discovery series. CPAESS scientists do everything from explore our ocean depths to fly into hurricanes, to heliophysicists that model corona mass injections and those that unravel the mysteries of the Arctic. And we want to share their science with you, the public, NSF, NCAR, and UCAR communities, and our many colleagues and at universities and agencies across the globe. Just to orientate you, today we are going to use Slido to ask questions. You can pose questions throughout the seminar, and we will address them at the end of the seminar. You will be able to find the tab at the top left of your screen. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Mei-Yun. Mei-Yun is one of our CPAESS scientists and a NASA Jack Eddy postdoctoral fellow at the Space Science Lab at the University of California, Berkeley. She obtained both her Ph.D. and her master's degree at the University of Illinois. This fall, she will also join the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Massachusetts as a tenured-track professor. Congratulations, Mei-Yun. Her research focuses on understanding the variations of the near-Earth environment, including the moon, in response to the space weather using numerical modeling and data analysis. Today, Mei-Yun will be speaking on metals from the moon, a comprehensive study on metallic ions in the magnetosphere. I am looking forward to hearing your talk, Mei-Yun, and Mei-Yun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be present this talk as my last responsibility as a NASA Jack Eddy Fellow. And I want to conclude what I have been done in the past 2 years and showing you what is the new research we have been working on at my position as the postdoc fellow at the UC Berkeley and UCAR.CPAESS. So I wanted to back up a little bit about our introductions. I wanted to show you what is the space weather. Space weather describes the variation in the space environment between the Sun and Earth. This could be divided by two components, sun and solar wind, and response from the near-Earth environment. Previous CPAESS Discovery Seminar introduced topic in the sun and solar wind components, and I'm glad to promote other Jack Eddy Fellows talk in June, May this year, and also December 2024. Those 3 talks comprehensively covers what has been done in the sun and solar wind with new technology. This talk instead will focus on the variation of the near-Earth environment in response to sun and solar wind input, which has not been covered in the Discovery Seminar, and I would give you a brief introduction of it. The Earth's magnetic field, also known as the geomagnetic field, is a magnetic field that extends from Earth's interior out into space. The interaction between the solar wind and the geomagnetic environment leads to perturbation in the Earth's magnetic field. Even small magnetic field perturbation of only 0.1% of the total magnetic field can cause a dramatic effect on the plasma surrounding the Earth, which we saw called the magnetosphere. This video demonstrates a numerical simulation that shows the constant changes of the density and geomagnetic field in response to the solar wind. This dramatic change of the near-Earth environment highlights a need to understand the source of the plasma and the fields in space and their responses to the external driving. So the color here showing you the density, blue means low density, red and yellow means high density, and the lines you see here showing you the geomagnetic field lines, which we could visualize as the geomagnetic field. Particularly, I wanted to point out Earth's geomagnetic field could trap particles that even with kilo eV or mega eV, and they form what we call an inner magnetosphere. These particles move in circular motion or gyrate around the field lines, but rarely interact with each other. The magic of this inner magnetosphere is from time to time, those energetic particles that could precipitate it to the atmosphere and impacts multiple facility and technology on the ground and space. So I would like to list some of the impact of the space weather and highlighted why we really need to study it. Multiple technology and facilities are impacted by the space weather. For example, the satellites can be damaged by increased radiation and their orbits can be affected. For instance, 38 Starlink internet satellites were lost due to a space weather event back in 2022. Furthermore, high-latitude flights can be rerouted to avoid increased radiation exposures, and radio communication can be affected. Most importantly, extreme space weather event can induce currents in long power lines, potentially causing widespread power outage. In 1989, a space weather event caused a 9-hour Quebec blackout. This examples an impact showing us that understanding how the Earth environment change in response to the solar wind is quite important to understand the space weather impact. How do we study the space weather impact? Well, the direct way we usually we will know is the aurora. Some researchers in our field, they study the space weather impact by the aurora, which is the most visible and beautiful effect. These lights are created when solar particles collide with the Earth's atmosphere, causing them to glow. The video shows the aurora observations from the International Space Stations. Also, other researchers in the geospace community, they study the space weather impact by analyzing the particle, field, and wave data. By studying how these variations in the magnetosphere, we could quantify the space weather impact into our Earth environment. For example, you can look at the particle and field or wave properties in different regions of the magnetosphere, shown as the right-hand side here. And if their direction are different, you can kind of draw a boundary between different regions, and that the change of that boundary is linked to how the solar wind store their energy and momentum in our magnetosphere environment. In this talk, we focus on the particles, particularly ionized components. As shown in the right figures, while neutrals, which is the gray circles here, are bounded by the gravitational force, ionized components, also called ions, could be transported along the magnetic field lines through the electromagnetic force. So the balance between the Lorentz force, electromagnetic force, Lorentz force here, and the gravitational force here controls how the ions have been moved and transported along the field lines. So that's part of the reason that the energetic particles from the inner magnetosphere, they can precipitate it to the atmosphere because the electromagnetic force drive them back to our atmosphere. In our magnetosphere, the ions are known to source from the solar wind or Earth atmosphere. These two sources of the plasma occupy the near-Earth environment. One is the solar wind, mainly composed of hydrogen ions and helium ions, and another one is the atmosphere and ionosphere, which is composed not only H plus and He plus, but also heavier species such as nitrogen and oxygen ions. The ionosphere is thought to be the ionic component of the atmosphere and exists to several thousand kilometers in space. These two sources are often obvious to identify based on the observational data. So the figure I'm showing here is you could identify the ions from the solar wind and ionosphere. And let me give you an example. This observational data is from the one of the spacecraft mission called GeoTel. GeoTel covers ranges from 9 RE to 30 RE for 27 years, from 1995 to 2020. The one of the instruments on the GeoTel that could observe the energy, mass of the ions, and based on those information, we could identify the charge state of the ions and also the mass of the ions. So the right-hand side showing you the y-axis is the mass of the ions from 1 to 64. The x-axis is the mass over charge, which showing you the charge state of the ions. Well, as we know, like the solar wind and ionosphere both contribute the hydrogen ions, then when you see the m over q is 1 and the mass is 1, and this box is showing you the hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions can both come in either from the solar wind or ionosphere. But things will be more obvious to identify in the large mass ions. In the large mass ions, if the charge state was like a multiple charge, which means they are not single charge state ions, those ions are most likely coming from the solar wind, because ionosphere doesn't produce a lot of the higher charge state ions, which means the red box here is definitely coming from the solar wind. The gray box here is thought to be coming from the ionosphere, because ionosphere is really powerful to produce the single charge state ions. And from here, the gray box, you can see the single charge state ions can cover the mass from 4 to 64. So that could cover like helium ions, nitrogen ions, oxygen ions, or even like irons. The observational data here reveals a significant presence of the single charge state ions in the mass range of 16 to 64. The explanation suggests that a substantial numbers of the large mass ions are outflowing from the Earth ionosphere. However, we would like to explore what other sources of the large mass particles might be, which means, is there any additional sources that could contribute this single charge large mass ions? And when I say large mass ions, which means their mass is over 30 MU, that cover like silicon, aluminum, or like irons. And this is the fundamental question I wanted to solve in this talk, is we want to know if there's additional sources of particles of heavy ions in Earth's magnetosphere. And that's the time I want to brought it out, the moon in the whole Earth and Sun system. This intriguing question arises to the focus of our talk today. We'd like to explore if the moon could contribute any of the sources to the magnetosphere. The moon is the Earth's only natural satellite. It is about 1/4 the diameter of Earth and orbits our planet at an average distance approximately 400,000 kilometers, which is about 60 Earth radius, and complete one full orbit around 28 days. This allows the moon spend about a quarter orbit inside the magnetosphere, and other time they spend outside the Earth magnetosphere. And this unique orbit makes Moon as a perfect place to the space weather research. First, when the moon is outside the magnetosphere, it serves as the frontier of this Earth space weather, because it often, most likely often in front of the Earth and between the Sun and Earth line. The second, when the moon is in the magnetosphere, it has a direct access to the magnetosphere. And then you can use that a quarter time to understand how does the magnetosphere looks like. And in this talk, we will focus on specific ions, which is the metallic ions that including like magnesium, aluminum, and silicon and irons. And our goal is to investigate whether the moon can influence the Earth's best weather and determine if its contribution is substantial enough to account for the ions observed in the magnetosphere. So the two questions we want to solve, the first one is what is the contribution of the metallic ion outflow from the moon across different solar driving? And second is what are the transport pathway of the lunar metallic ions in the magnetosphere? We not only want to study what's happening on the moon, but we also want to know what is the impact of the moon to the Sun-Earth system. Unlike Earth, the moon has a thin atmosphere but no global magnetic field, allowing the impacting particles to modify its surface rigorously directly. The collection of this process helps the moon sustain a tenuous, surface-bounded neutral atmosphere, the so-called lunar exosphere. And in the history, how do we find it? Our moon has the atmosphere is through the optical instrument. So the left-hand side showing you one of the previous observation about the lunar atmosphere. Which is from the Boston University, and they use their optical instrument looking at the moon, and that could tell them the one of the component in the lunar exosphere, which is the sodium layers. And by that, they could identify the shape of the sodium layers around the moon, and that helps an intriguing question like, how does this sodium elements like form their population surrounding the moon? The lunar exosphere is formed via the impact of the solar wind particles and meteorites. These incoming particles could directly impact the lunar surface and scatter neutral species from the lunar soil. And because this process is coming from different sources, also we often categorize them as one of the solar wind sputtering and one of micrometeorite impact vaporizations. So the difference is the solar wind sputtering is these particles coming from the solar wind and mainly composed of the protons or even a little bit heavier species, what we call the helium double plus, and we can call it as alpha particles. The other category is the micrometeorite impact, which is like meteorites, but in the micro scale. Same as the Earth, like the moon could be impacted by this micro scale meteorite impact, and they can directly impact the lunar surface, and that could kick out a neutral species from the lunar surface. Since more than 30% of the lunar soil is composed of the metals, metals are important elements in the lunar exosphere. Those neutral metals undergo the ionization processes and become the metallic ions. These newly born metallic ions could be picked up by either the solar wind or the magnetosphere plasma, depends on where the moon is, and they become the ions that transported in the near-Earth environment. Well, the lunar pickup ions has been known significantly in the lunar community because detecting the neutrals is more difficult than detecting the ions. For neutrals, you often need to either create an optical instrument or you have to create an in situ instrument. But the drawback for those is the optical instrument is very focused on specific species, and for the in situ measurement, you often have to deal with like the sensitivity issues, of which is very hard for the researchers to understand how does the lunar exosphere look like. on the other hand, detecting ions is more direct forward because you can just create an in situ measurement that could observe the lunar pickup ions directly. And by looking at those ions, you can derive how does the lunar exosphere distribution looks like. And one of the example is a Japanese lead lunar missions called Kaguya. Kaguya is a lunar mission back in 2008 to 2009, which is only like a 1.5 year of the short-term mission. But it did observe a lot of pickup ion species around the moon. The right-hand side shows you the upper panel shows you their observational spectrum, and the lower panel shows you their calibrated data. The calibrated data, the y-axis is the count, and x-axis is the time of flight. So based on this time of flight signal, you could categorize those signals to responding ion species. And from this Kaguya data, they found out the highest count rates were the ions with masses near 28 and the 40. So if you look at those the mass of the ions corresponding to 2840, and that corresponding to aluminum and silicon, or like CO plus, and for mass 40 that corresponding to potassium and argon 40. And by this observational data, you could see there's a significant presence of metallic ions near the moon. So our question is, could metallic ions observed previously in the magnetosphere source from the moon or not? Unfortunately, the abundances of the lunar metallic ions have not been understood a lot, particularly their contribution during different times and along the moon's orbit. And also, unfortunately, there are no in situ measurements to directly identify the metallic ions in the near moon environment. So in this study, our goal is to quantify how much metallic ions have been sourced from the moon, and we use the available data, which is the Artemis-Themis data. And based on this data, we can first understand how the lunar exosphere looks like and how the ionization process looks like. By combining those two information, we can derive how much lunar neutrals have been converted to the ionic component, and that could tell us the sources of the lunar peak ions that have been produced from the lunar surface. And that eventually our goal is to get the fluxes that produce from the lunar surface. The data we are using is called Themis-Artemis data. It's the two identical props orbiting currently around the moon. It was in an elliptical plane, shown as the XY and XZ plane here. So you can clearly see P1, P2, which is there are two probes, and they are orbiting around the elliptical planes. And there's no mass spectrometer available on Themis-Artemis, but they do have a spectrometer that can telling you the total ions that that detected by the instrument. So the total ions can give us, most likely the total ions is mainly composed of the protons. So we can use this observational data to understand how many proton particles have been impacted the lunar surface, and we start from that positions. So the first part of our diagram is we wanted to know how does the lunar exosphere looks like. In other words, how does the neutral production looks like from the lunar surface. And as I said, that the Themis Artemis, they have this total ion spectrum has been observed. So they're telling you that what is the energy and what is the total ion fluxes. And this is from 2019, November 26 for a whole a lunar orbit. So it's about a month. You can clearly see in some part of this spectrum, the spectrum focuses on the 1000 EV, and in some other parts, you could see like border energy range. And in fact, this 1000 EV is the solar wind protons. So you can see that this is how many solar wind protons have been impacted the lunar surface. With that information, we could know the phi E, which is the solar wind protons, and then we multiply by the yield of the sputtering effect, and that we could know what is the rate of the neutrons that are being sputtered out from the lunar surface. And noted that there are two processes that could produce the lunar metals. One is the solar wind particles, and one is the micrometeorite impact, which we so-call as the MIV here. And they are under different processes and on different times, so we could like estimate their production rate individually. And what we found that is in most of the time, when the moon is outside the magnetosphere, which is inside the solar wind particles directly impact the lunar surface. But once it turns to the magnetosphere, it first encounter different regions. So the magnetosheet is the boundary regions between the solar wind and the magnetosphere. So at that time, the particle started to decrease its velocity. And in the magnetotail, if you remember from one of the video I showed, it was undergo a very low density plasma regions, which means at this time, there's not a lot of particles hitting the lunar surface. Then when the moon is going through the orbit, we'll go back to the boundary region magnetosheet again and back to the solar wind. So what we found it out is like the production of the neutral metals is undergo different processes in different regions. In the solar wind regions, it's mainly impacted by the solar wind particles and not a lot about the micrometeorite impact. But in the magnetosphere, when moon is transfers the magnetosphere regions, even though it only spends like 7 days, but at this time, the solar wind particle it cannot penetrate the magnetosphere, and then the micrometeorite impact will be the dominated mechanisms. And the sputtering rate, which you could see in the upper panel, the production rate decreases like an order of magnitude when the moon is passing through the magnetosphere. The second part is now we know like the neutrons production has been varied by different regions of the lunar orbit. How about the ionization rate? When the neutrons being kicked out from the lunar surface, they could be ionized from different processes. For example, they can be ionized from photoionization, they could ionize by electron impact or charge exchange with the solar wind protons. So we actually using the Artemis-Themis data to understand how the protons look like and how the electrons spectrum look like, and we could calculated the ionization rate. So the left figure showing the ionization rate in different year of the time. The y-axis is the sunspot number that's showing you how the solar activity looks like. So when the sunspot number is high, it means the sun is more active. So we know that there are more protons that are more energetic particles that have been carried by the solar wind. When the sunspot number is low, which means the sun is in the solar minimum, then this time the sun is quite stable and they don't bring a lot of energetic particles to the magnetosphere. And we draw the photoionization, electron impact, and proton charge exchange rate to see if those ionization rates have been varied by the solar cycles. And in general, the photoionization rate is varied by the solar cycles, but not a lot by the electron impact and proton charge exchange rate. When the ions, when the neutrons become ions, they could escape from the lunar exosphere, but some of the neutrons, they couldn't get ionized by those processes. Even maybe the reason is the rate is too low, so they couldn't get ionized at the end. Those neutrons will be recycled back to the surface and become a neutral recycle. So the third part of the diagram is we define a term called ionization fractions, which is to describe the ionization portion of the produced neutral metals. So those metals that have been produced from the lunar surface, they can escape, but and that is the ionization fractions. And this parameter can be also referred to as the escape possibility of the lunar pickup ions. Therefore, the production rate is influenced by the ionization lifetime and also the ballistic travel time, because when the neutrons has been kicked out from the lunar surface, they're going through the ballistic travel. So I list some of the equation we have been used to identify the ballistic travel time, also the ionization time, and I give you an example. So one of the example is what is the ionization fraction, which is the escape probability for those ions to escape from the lunar surface in terms of different species, like sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, potassium, and calcium and irons. The red line showing you the sputtering from the solar wind, and the gray line showing the micrometeorite impact. So what we found out is the solar wind particle is quite effective to produce the pickup ions. And that because the solar wind particles are more energetic in general than the micrometeorite impact. So when the solar wind particles hit the lunar surface, the neutrons that have been produced from the solar wind particles, they will most likely become the pickup ions. And on the other hand, when the micrometeorite impact the lunar surface, only 10% of them will become the ions, and 90% of them will become neutrals and cycle back to the lunar surface. So for those simulation and for those diagrams, eventually what we do is we could derive the lunar fluxes produced by the moon, and then because the moon is going through different regions, we could know how the fluxes varies by the moon's locations. So the top panels is the fluxes versus the lunar orbit. So in the solar wind regions, the lunar flux is about like 10 to 5 per centimeter cube per second. And then when the moon is inside the magnetosphere, those number will decrease by like 3 orders of magnitude, because at this time there's not of neutrons being produced from the solar wind, and but when then back to the solar wind regions again, it back to like 10 to 5 centimeter cube per second. Another thing I wanted to point out is the mechanism to produce the lunar pickup ions are different in different regions. So inside the magnetosphere, the ions has been mostly produced from the micrometeorite impact, and outside the magnetosphere, that has been mostly produced by the solar wind particles. And we can draw like distribution functions to know like to understand like, okay, maybe it's like a 30% of the time, which corresponding to the lunar orbit time, that the probability of the production rate is corresponding to the lunar orbit as well. We not only just study like a case study for a lunar orbit, we actually did like 12 years of the data, because even now the famous Artemis is still surrounding the Earth, the moon environment. And the left-hand side showing you like the fluxes of the metallic ions from different time, and we categorize by different solar cycles. And in general, we didn't really found a huge difference of the lunar pickup ions between solar maximum and solar minimum. And the right-hand side is like the similar idea of the solar, the pickup ion fluxes and overlaps with the sunspot numbers. But in the right-hand side, we even showing you the minimum and maximum number of the ion fluxes. So the maximum number are more likely caused by the geomagnetic storm activity, and the minimum number is like when the moon is inside the magnetosphere. So even though the average number is not depends on the solar activity, the maximum number do increase during the solar maximum. We also compare by different species, and we draw a diagram to know like what is the average fluxes for different species, and what is the maximum and minimum. And as I said before, that the maximum value will corresponding to the extreme conditions, and the minimum value will corresponding when the moon is passing through the magnetosphere. So the y-axis is the lunar pickup ion fluxes, then the x-axis was the metallic ion species. From this diagram, the most important part of this is the two species are the dominant species from the moon, which is aluminum and silicon. And interesting enough, those species, their mass is close to mass 28. So back to the one of the introduction slide about the geotel observational data, that we found a significant presence of the large mass ions in Earth magnetosphere, and we wanted to identify like what is the additional contribution of the moon to the whole system. So what we did is we used the lunar pickup ion fluxes we derived in this study and compare with the potential metallic ions or heavy ions from Earth ionosphere. So we compare that in the left-hand side. In general, Earth ionosphere do contribute more heavy ions in the magnetosphere. But when it comes to like large mass ions, which is showing you like the green, like or like pink, black, and gray, and also in the moon is like purple and brown, with corresponding to different species. The moon, the peak ion fluxes from the moon actually is comparable to the Earth ionosphere. So that telling us like the significant presence of the large mass ions we observe in the magnetosphere is likely both sourced from moon and Earth atmosphere. Now we understand the source, but another question is, will these lunar metallic ions reach the inner magnetosphere? As we know, like the moon is orbits around the Earth magnetosphere all the time, and that will interact with different region of the Earth magnetosphere. And when you interact with the different region of the Earth magnetosphere, they will interact with different plasma, different velocity, and different density. So that will impact the possibility of the transport of the lunar metallic ions to the inner magnetosphere. There are two important factors to understanding these questions. One is the solar activity. And the reason why we need to know about the solar activity is because solar activity actually modulates the field and a plasma velocity in the magnetosphere. the right-hand side showing you like the YZ plane of the velocity, the plasma velocity in the lunar distance, which is the yellow plane I highlighted here. So in different time, you could see that the plasma velocity topology looks very different. And if you look into their number is the light colors corresponding to earthward flow and the dark color corresponding to anti-earthward flow. And what does that mean in general in physics is the earthward flow means the ions could be transported back to the inner magnetosphere. And anti-earthward flow means the ions will be transported tailward and to like hundreds of Earth radius and will never turn back. So we could know that in different solar activity, the plasma velocity will look very different. Another interesting factor is the lunar position because the moon interacts and orbits around the Earth magnetosphere, so they controls like the plasma region that interact with the particles. So how do we solve these questions? We used the particle tracing, and what we did is we released lunar particles in its orbit in different times and different locations, and plus with different solar activities. And this particle tracing requires the temporal magnetic field and electric field provided by the MHD model. So the model we are using here is called OpenGGCM, which is one of the magnetosphere models in the geospace community. The MHD model it gives us how the field looks like, how the velocity looks like, and that will be calculated in our particle tracing code. And 5 idealized condition has been implemented here that depends on different BY and different BZ from 5 to 10. In each simulation, we releases like 10,000 iron particles in various lunar position along its orbit. Left-hand side showing you 2 different idealized conditions. And I believe like one of them is the BZ equals positive and one of them is BZ equals to negative. So we implement a particle tracing code that incorporate all this temporal variation of the field and the velocity, and we calculated how the particles from the moons transported in the magnetosphere in general. And this is our results. We found that metallic ions released from the moon could be trapped in the magnetosphere. And this happens when the moon is in the magnetosphere regions. So not in the solar region, was in the magnetosphere regions. And it started about here in my mouse here. And then the purple line shows you that those particles actually transported all the way to the inner magnetosphere. And the grid line is they are not transported to the inner magnetosphere, they actually just escape through the tail. And I'm showing you 2 perspectives. One is the XY plane, and one is the XZ plane. So what we found is if we release like 500 released particles, in this case, 10 particles at least will reach the inner magnetosphere in 2 to 4 hours. To get like a collective result, we not only release like 500 particles, we release like 10,000 particles trajectory. And how do we quantify those results is we divided the whole magnetosphere to like 90 times 92 times cells. So each cell is like a 1RE times 1RE times 1RE cube. And when the particle is going through that cells, we count its presence. And we count the whole 6 hours. So we could like account all of the particle trajectory, and that give you us a statistical results of the particles. And to give you a simplified ideas of the counts, we normalize the particle counts, and all the counts will be divided by maximum number of it. The left-hand side showing you one of the example of it, like the moon is in the 60 Earth radius position and the Earth was in the 0 to 0 position. And this showing you the XY plane, which means we actually, in this figure, we accumulate all the Z planes together. The maximum number was 1, which means like that was the maximum number. And you could see that the count was focuses on 2 parts. It's either in the tail part, but also in the inner magnetosphere. So that telling us in this specific case, there is significant amount of the particles that transported to the magnetosphere. And to understand this, you can like look at these figures with the previous trajectory that the reason we only have this asymmetry is the particles is more likely to transport it in the in the positive y plane instead of negative y plane. So most of the particles, they will be picked up by the magnetosphere plasma and then they gyroid all the way to the inner magnetosphere. Some of the particles do demonstrate this pink trajectory that they will go through the circular motion to like the whole magnetosphere, but most of the particles they either like going to halfway and they were going back, or like they will be lost to the magnetosheet and escape to the tail. So there are different trajectories, but most likely they have this asymmetry in their pathways. We not only found one specific case, you can find the metallic ions in the magnetosphere. I list 2 other examples, and I listed their solar activity condition and the lunar locations. So there are 2 things we observed in this simulation result is the solar activity is only happens during positive busy conditions. And what does that mean is like it's mostly occurs during the quiet condition. And then another thing is the lunar position, like the metallic ions are found in the inner magnetosphere when the moon is close to the midnight plane. So when they're close, like going through the equatorial plane. And in fact, most of the conditions, you do not have metallic ions transported into the inner magnetosphere. And I give you some of the examples, like either their solar activity condition is not correct, or like the lunar position is too far away from the midnight plane. And in this case, the lunar pickup ions, they just escape the tail once they leave the lunar surface. So the last question I wanted to solve is why do we have this different results of metallic ion transport into the magnetosphere and the one not transported into it? And when we look at the plasma velocity, it's quite obvious that this is associated with the earthward flow in the lunar distance. So the picture shows here is the MHD velocity and with the lunar orbit. The left-hand side is during the negative busy conditions, and the right-hand side is during the positive busy conditions. So the earthward flow during the positive busy condition, which we call northward IMF, plays a key role to transport the metallic ions back to the inner magnetosphere. And you didn't see that earthward flow in the southward IMF. As I say, like the light color, which corresponding to the earthward flow, and the dark color corresponding to anti-earthward flow. So if we put all the pieces together, in this like positive busy conditions, and if we draw the plasma velocity along the lunar orbit, there are two specific spots you can have the earthward flow, and they are close to the midnight plane, which is the y close to 0. When you release the particles close to the earthward flow locations, then you are possible to transport the metallic ions to the inner magnetosphere. When you release the particles like far away from the midnight plane, then those particles just basically transported tailward and never turn back. And you could see that in the trajectory too, that if the trajectory is too far away from the lunar orbit, it's basically just transported away. And when it was in the midnight plane, it could possibly transport it back to the inner magnetosphere. So I wanted to conclude my talk here today. We first talk about the source of the lunar pickup ions. This lunar metallic ion fluxes, as well as the lunar exosphere, vary based on the moon location, but not heavily reliant on solar activity. A contribution of the heavy ion outflow when their mass is larger than like 30 mu, 16 mu, they could be comparable to those of the ionosphere in the terrestrial environment, and that telling us that the metallic ions we observed in the inner magnetosphere or like a magnetosphere, that could be both coming from the ionosphere and the moon. And the second part of this talk, I briefly talk about the transport of the metallic ions, that if you want to catch the metallic ions in the magnetosphere, you would need the earthward flow in the lunar distance. And this earthward flow near the lunar distance is preferentially occur during the northward IMF conditions when the moon is transverse the midnight plane. So this telling you that in what condition you will most likely observe this heavier species from the moon in the Earth magnetosphere. And this concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mei-Yun. That was a fascinating talk. We really appreciate it. Now we're at our Q&A portion of today's seminar. So I just want to direct you back to our Slido. We have a Slido on the screen right now, so you can click the Slido or follow the QR code to get to our question section. Please go ahead and post questions for Mei-Yun. While you are doing that, I do want to invite you to also check out our website, CPAESS at UCAR.CPAESS for upcoming seminars. We have one scheduled for September 17th. That's a Wednesday at 11 o'clock Mountain Time. And that will be Ralph Dustin Ralph is one of our CPAESS scientist. He is over at the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, or GFDL for short. And we would like to invite you to join us for that talk as well. And also this talk, as well as future and past talks, is on our CPAESS YouTube channel. So please go there and see what is on our channel. With that, I am going to pass it over to Alex to monitor our questions.
Well, it looks like we do have a question for you, and it is, where would you like this research to go next?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and I can divide it to the future direction to two places. One is this research is rarely focuses on the Earth-Moon interactions, and this has not been included in the space weather for like significantly in the past. But you can definitely bring this back to like understand like the evolution of the Earth history, like this telling you like the particles like released from the moon and particles released from the Earth that definitely interact with each other. But this interactions is varied by condition like solar activity or even like the Earth-Moon's distance. So in the Earth-Moon system back in like early Earth conditions, actually is now like 60 Earth radius away, like Moon in like early Earth conditions only like 40 Earth radius away. And in that time, you could definitely have more frequent interaction between like Earth and Moon together. So this research is really, you can doing this as a like geology study. Like you can understand like what if we can catch some of the Earth ions to the Moon, or what we can if we can catch some of the Moon topology in the Earth history. So this really opens a discussion about the Earth-Moon system interactions. And another part is definitely linked to the lunar science, but in a different ways. So think about if you want to build a facility on the lunar surface, and that facility eventually will generate a huge amount of the particles released to the lunar atmosphere. And this study showing you that part of those particles might be transported back to our near-Earth environment. So when we wanted to do some like ambitious work on the surface of the moon, we need to account those transport because the near-Earth environment changes all the time, and this earthward flow could be present and at those locations, and they can bring the ions that you might not want them to be back eventually from if you want to build a facility on the lunar surface. So that was like one is more like application part, and the other one is more like a geology and like a planetary science.
That's fascinating. I never thought of that. And I could see how pragmatic that would be as we continue to explore space and build more things out. Um, so as a non-heliophysicist, I'm just going to ask a question. Um, do you think that is part of this research by understanding these particle flows to help protect the Earth then and Earth citizens from different space weather? Is that correct? And also, how would we do that? Or is this just the very first step in doing that?
No, I think this is like a very good question. The one of the motivation for this research is I wanted to understand the boundary of the plasma source. For example, if we could found a significant portion of the solar ions in our magnetosphere, then that means we have to spend a lot of time and effort to understanding how the solar wind contribute to the magnetosphere. And the same thing for this work is we wanted to know if the lunar plasma could contribute to the near-Earth environment. And if that is a lot, maybe we should take care of that ideas. And the Earth workflow, as I said, like this really coming from that research that we didn't expect this result. Honestly, when we first doing this research, we didn't know that there's a significant presence of the Earth workflow that could be potentially bring back the ions from the moon all the way back to the inner magnetosphere. And that's is really important. If you remember one of the video I showing about the inner magnetosphere in like the first 2-3 slides of these presentations, like some of the energetic particles in the inner magnetosphere that could penetrate to the atmosphere eventually, and that could interact with the atmosphere too. So you can think about that if you have any of the lunar ions and they are like heavier species. So like mass is like large mass ions, and eventually they're going down to the atmosphere. How does that interact with the atmosphere? And our if our atmosphere could be protected by those one, and this is really we wanted to know that if this is a process we should be really careful for, and that somehow protects our atmosphere by being polluted by those heavier species.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have any more questions, so I'm going to turn this back over to Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for everybody that joined us today, and for Mei-Yun, again, thank you very much for this fascinating seminar. We would like to thank our team here that has worked tirelessly in the background to make this work. Alex from CPAESS, Jesse Webb, our multimedia services, Dawn Mullally from our communications group, for all your valuable assistance to make today happen. We hope to see all of you at our next seminar series in September. And do follow us on YouTube as well as on our CPAESS website for upcoming events in the seminar series. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.